I'm Alan Matiso, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome everybody here this afternoon. Our event is a lecture by Professor Douglas Brinkley, who is the Theodore Roosevelt, Director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center for American Civilization and Professor of History at Tulane University. I actually don't know too many American historians who are able to transcend academic boundaries and make it into the world of the public intellectuals. I can think of Arthur Schlesinger, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Michael Beschloss, and Douglas Brinkley. He is, first of all, a professional historian, maybe the most prolific historian of recent memory. In the decade after he received his PhD from Georgetown University in 1989, he wrote, among other things, 4 substantial biographical studies. He has a book on the career of Dean Acheson after Dean Acheson ended his tenure as Secretary of State. He has a book on Jimmy Carter after Jimmy Carter's presidency. He has a biography of James Forrestal, who was the first Secretary of Defense and a very significant figure in the history of the early Cold War, and he has a biography of Rosa Parks. These books have been well reviewed by historians, are respected books within the profession, and remarkably, they also have a readership beyond the profession. And not too many historians have been successful at reaching that larger audience. Since then, his productivity has not slowed down. Among other books, he has published in recent years Wheels for the World, Henry Ford, The Company, and A Century of Progress, Tour of Duty, John Kerry and the Vietnam War, and very recently, The Great Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. The last 2 of those were actually on the bestseller list of the New York Times. He also is interested in American culture. He has he has edited the letters remind me, Douglas, of Hunter Thompson, and the journals of Jack Kerouac. Just a couple of weeks ago in the Sunday New York Times, he had an excellent review of a recent biography of Johnny Cash. In addition to all this, he has a substantial body of high-quality journalism. He's on op-ed pages. His pieces appear in leading magazines of opinion in the United States. I don't personally know how anyone can do as much as Douglas Brinkley has done in these years. He doesn't sleep much, drinks a lot of coffee, and was endowed at birth by a superabundance of talent. You have seen him on TV, you've heard him on the radio. We are fortunate to have him here today, and he's going to talk about one of his current projects, which is the Reagan Diary. He's editing that. So welcome, Douglas, to the platform.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for spending some time with me this afternoon. And thank you all for just being here. I know it's beautiful out, and I know it's a Friday, and but I appreciate you stopping by here and hearing me say a few things. And I might add, since he mentioned a number of books that I've written, if there's some other topic in a brief Q&A we'll do that you want to talk about, particularly with Hurricane Katrina or what's going on in New Orleans right now, or from a FEMA or city government or federal government, any aspect of the Katrina situation, New Orleans, Mississippi Gulf Coast, please feel free to ask either. It's a public question or we can do it privately after my talk. But I was asked to speak on Ronald Reagan's diary, and that's what I'm going to do. The story of this diary is unique, and my role in it came about quite surprisingly. I teach at Tulane University, and as Alan mentioned, I write books on U.S. history. A few years ago, I went over with Wolf Blitzer for CNN to, as the historian commentator for the D-Day anniversary, the 60th anniversary of D-Day. And we were over at Normandy on June 5th that evening, 2004, when we got word at CNN that Ronald Reagan had just died. And there was something ironic about it, to the degree that Reagan's most famous speech, the bookend speeches, most famous soundbite speech is the "Tear Down This Wall." But the other big speech, and it was the first one that Peggy Noonan wrote, she was a young CBS speechwriter for Dan Rather, when an editor at the National Review found out about her and ended up bringing her into the Reagan White House. She never met Ronald Reagan, even once as a speechwriter, when she wrote the speech, "The Boys of Pointe du Hoc." But it's quite an extraordinary sight there at Normandy if you're at the cemetery and you see the graves of these young Americans who died in the attempt of liberating Europe. And President Reagan had gone over in 1984. He was the first American president to ever visit the Normandy cemetery. Dwight Eisenhower went back to Normandy and was interviewed by Walter Cronkite there as ex-president. But Reagan's famous '84 journey was a landmark. And it really, a fellow will be in this Sunday's New York Times, a man named David Halpfinger for the New York Times, in fact, just called me for the week in review in the Times, and he's doing a piece on how the greatest generation was born and is it dying off now in popular culture. Because before there was Stephen Ambrose and his D-Day book and Citizen Soldier and Band of Brothers and Pegasus Bridge, or before Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, or before Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, Ronald Reagan had started promoting this greatest generation idea in 1984. It was done partially for political reasons. They were trying to win over what so-called Reagan Democrats, senior citizens in '84, many of whom may have been sympathetic to Walter Mondale on issues of Social Security, which is a traditional Democratic issue. But they wanted to grab that generation, the new senior citizens, over the issue of patriotism, that whole "it's morning again in America," the again being the World War II years. And President Reagan, and you'll notice people that had a bit of a romanticization about World War II, and that happens when he served in the war and became a captain with Army Air Corps, but he never went to combat, Ronald Reagan. And what he was the propagandist for Army Air Corps, for Hap Arnold in World War II, and made over 300 training films, 300 during World War II, talking about the virtues of the armed service and the Army Air Corps people. Well, as president, those people he was promoting World War II were the new old. They were the new senior citizens. And in this dramatic speech at Pointe du Hoc, he had invited all of the U.S. Army 2nd Rangers Division to come and hear his speech. Michael Deaver, the great stagecrafter for Ronald Reagan, stagecrafted. So behind the podium when Reagan spoke on June 6th of 1984, there was the Ranger dagger behind him, and then the entire English Channel. And Reagan, who loved these World War II stories, was fed and learned the story of the Army Rangers. We had no Rangers in the United States at the time of World War II. The term had been around since the French and Indian War. It used to mean in a wilderness outpost, guides would go out about 30 miles, 40 miles and circle a community and kind of try to protect it from possible attack. Rangers was adopted by the Confederacy, by Mosby's Rangers in the Civil War. The term Ranger, certainly here in Texas, has a long and distinguished history. But there were no Rangers in World War II. A big debate came over it. Dwight Eisenhower did not want Special Forces created. Ike and George Marshall believed that it was a big mistake for the Army to take the elite, the best out of the best, and put them in a special group. So they fought very hard against creating Special Forces during World War II. But a man named Lieutenant Truscott prevailed upon Marshall that we need to model a group after the commandos that Winston Churchill had at his disposal in Great Britain. Hence, we had the first Army Rangers created. They fought in North Africa, distinguishedly. They were known by the Italians, the first Army Rangers of World War II, as the Black Death. They were trained to do amphibious warfare, rope climbing. They were learned to be proficient with billy clubs, knives. They were just what you would suppose of a special forces person of today. But the Second Army Rangers got created, and this was the story Reagan was enamored with. And they were created by Chattanooga, Tennessee, for a special mission. Thousands of people volunteered to be in the Army Second Rangers. It was looking for the best people in the Army. Out of those 1,000 that trained in Tennessee, a man from Texas, a legendary man from Texas, Earl Rudder, who later became the president of Texas A&M. But Earl Rudder, they were known as Rudder's Rangers, picked out 225 of these Rangers. And many dropped off. They weren't looking for, they were looking for something deeper than ability of endurance. Certainly they were running in humidity, people were dropping off, dehydration, people couldn't hack it. But they weren't always the best people physically. They were looking for initiative. They were screening almost the way if you read Tom Wolfe's novel, The Right Stuff, New Journalism, The Not Right Stuff, when they were looking for this special group. It was a similar kind of exercise to find these 225. From Tennessee, they went to Fort Pierce in Florida, where they were trained with amphibious warfare. Obviously, our SEALs of today were not created to President Kennedy's era, but basically they were getting what today we would consider SEAL training in amphibious attack in Florida. I've interviewed all of those survivors of these 225. They then went up to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and they started understanding what their mission was going to be at Fort Dix, because they were being taught German and French. And it became apparent that they were going to be sent to Europe, not Asia. And they left around Christmas time, 1943, on the Queen Elizabeth in civilian clothes, landed in England, and were dispersed and given Cornish farmhouses to live in, 225 different ones spread out around Cornwall. They would have secret rendezvous, this 225, and would go to what is the Isle of Wight, where these cliffs are. And their mission became in tighter focus at that point, because suddenly, and they had training in New Jersey on this, they started training climbing straight up sheer cliffs. And through January and February and March of 44, they kept climbing and climbing and climbing. Here where I live in New Orleans, we have a National D-Day Museum because it's where Andrew Jackson Higgins built the Higgins boats. Adolf Hitler called it Noah's Navy, and was very worried about the industries of boat building being tested down here in the bayous of Texas, Louisiana area. But Britain had their own, and the Higgins boats would carry 35 to 37 soldiers, fully equipped, but no equipment. And as anybody who's seen Saving Private Ryan knows, those back doors would drop down and off you run on shore. We in New Orleans actually reconstructed a Higgins boats. There are none that have survived the Second World War. They were built in that flimsy of fashion. They were meant to do a quick duty of getting soldiers onto shores. So these guys were training on these sort of Higgins boats by the Isle of Wight in those early months of 44. They were mountain climbing. But also, they did exercises on these Higgins boats, landing craft. They built a machine that would shoot a rope 150 feet in the air with a grapnel, and the ropes would hang down. And it was a device put on the boats, and these guys would then climb straight up off of that. The training exercises at the Isle of Wight went perfectly. And by April of 1944, Colonel Rudder was told that he was picked, and these Rangers second, to do the #1 mission of D-Day for Dwight Eisenhower. What Eisenhower considered the most important mission, and that was to take out the 6 big German blasting guns, 155 millimeter French-made blasting guns that the Nazis had, overlooking Pointe du Hoc there at Normandy. These guns were in fortified cement and metal in metal pillhouse-like situation on the cliff. These guys were going to pull the boats in, fire up the ropes, climb 150 feet straight up the promontory while the Germans were firing on them. Earl Rudder told these Rangers in a private meeting, guys, this is a suicide mission, and I recommend all of you don't go on it. All of you can quit now. Of course, this is a great football coach kind of psychology, knowing probably they wouldn't, but he said, I can't, he goes, we're going to, half of you won't come out of this alive, and you will be not, we will move you somewhere else. You can get out of it. There'll be zero embarrassment. I cannot send people on suicide missions, nor will the Army, but this is what our mission is. And of course, none of them left. All said, yes, sir, they were glad to be that first line of attack. As we know, D-Day was supposed to be June 5th, but the bad weather in the English Channel made it prohibitive. The waters were beyond choppy, and overcast with rain. Eisenhower postponed D-Day to June 6th, 44. That night of the 5th, when they were told they were leaving the next morning, they all ate together, and all of these Army Rangers, the 225, got food poisoning from hot dogs. They were ill as can be. They also got to write their goodbye letters to their loved ones, and I've refound those letters from the ones that survived that I could find. And it was, when you look at these letters, they couldn't tell what their mission was for security reasons. But it was amazing the mundaneness of the letters, of the haunting detail, like, honey, don't forget to fix the barn door, that's this, or remember to make sure that so-and-so. And when you read these, it's the letter knowing you may not come back. And instead of, there was always, of course, a loving tone, but it was always these little things you wanted to make sure your mother or your wife or sister or whoever got done. They left the next morning on these boats, and one of the hardest parts of the veterans I've interviewed was that they could not turn back and rescue people on these Higgins boats, meaning a couple of them sank because the water was so high and choppy, but they couldn't go back and save their own guys, and it's haunted them that they couldn't save their best friends. The mission was that imperative. Due to navigational blunders we don't have time to get into today, but Earl Rudder was 45 minutes about 45 minutes off course due to the weather, the fog. That delay cost dearly because when these ramps came down, they thought they were going right on the beach. And as Spielberg captured excellent fashion in Saving Private Ryan, the sinking when they ran off and they had to rip their equipment off and then come to shore being shot at with no gun, no equipment, just standing there. Other problem that occurred because of the water pouring in and they were bailing these boats, the ropes got waterlogged. So when the firing mechanism fired, they only went, about 70 instead of 150, yards in. It wasn't it didn't go high enough. So many of them had to climb halfway up the promontory and then claw their way up to the top while being shot. The idea here was one objective: destroy those 6 big blasting guns, and they had on them thermite grenades that if you went up to the gun, it would melt the firing mechanisms and destroy the guns. Remember, we couldn't do Allied bombing either in advance of D-Day because we did soften the area, but we didn't want the Germans to realize that that was the spot. Now, we did have paratroopers come in behind the enemy lines, and we kind of squeezed the enemy in between, but the bombing was wildly imprecise, and you couldn't bomb while this raid was going on because you'd end up killing the guys climbing the cliffs. So they were on to their own devices. Out of 225, 99 survived the climb. The rest were killed, so it was what Rudder told them, over half. Rudder broke orders not to go. He was, as commanding officer, told not to go. He went and was terribly injured, but he made it to the top with bullet holes to the top of Pointe du Hoc. I focused on a book I wrote, Boys of Pointe du Hoc, on 2 men. Lem Lamel, who lives up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, is the chief of police, just retired, and a man named Jack Cohen, who just died. Those 2 guys got to the top, buddied up, And when these Rangers came up there, there's a little firefights with a few German soldiers, but then they went into these boxes and the guns were gone. The Germans, recognizing that this big invasion was underway, had rollers on the guns. They had rolled them away. And immediately these Rangers knew, well, they couldn't be too far away because they had blasted in the morning the big guns. So we knew that they were a few hours ago that they were there. People spread out, fanned out looking for them. And Lamel and Kuhn found about a football field 100 yards away. They saw a Nazi officer with a clipboard and all of these Nazi soldiers around, and he was lecturing them holding the clipboard. And about 50 yards away from them were the guns by an apple orchard. They collected their thermite grenades, and thermite grenades have heat of over it's about 3,500 degrees of heat. And it makes that hiss, but it's not a boom, and it melts the metal. He crawled on his belly, Lem Lamel, with Jack Kuhn covering him, put the grenades in, and melted down those firing mechanisms of two of the guns, went back, got more thermite grenades from other Rangers, crawled back, and did the same, dislodging the guns while the Germans were still debating what to do. We know what they were going to do was move those guns to Utah Beach. The phrase is in military bloody Omaha for the casualties inflicted at Omaha. Utah did not have that many casualties, and that's because these guns didn't get moved there. If they got moved, Utah would have been a bloody wreck. And remember, these guns were going to start pounding the armada that was coming in. That story of climbing straight up, obviously for a person like Reagan, could take a story like that and go a long ways with it. And what the Bush White House did in '84 was invite all of those Rangers back to Normandy. So when he gave his speech, which was broadcast on all the morning TV shows, all of the Rangers and their family survivors were there. And, you know, these were the boys of Pointe du Hoc, Reagan. They climbed up, and Reagan went from February of 1984, February with the 27% approval rating in foreign affairs, to the week after his World War II European tour commemorative speeches to 67%, and never faded. It was a turning point for him, and they used the boys of Pointe du Hoc, the Republicans, for their convention that summer. Walter Mondale has said that it was the speech is what killed me. It gave Reagan, instead of seeming an extremist on the right, as being a spokesperson for the greatest generation. It was a perfect role for Ronald Reagan, and he seized that moment, both heartfelt but also pragmatically. So when I wrote that book after Ronald Reagan's death, it got some attention in reviews, and it became a bestseller for me. And shortly after that, I was more known as, I wrote the book on John Kerry in the Vietnam War, and I wrote a biography of Jimmy Carter as ex-president. So, and this book was really about World War II that I did, not particularly, although it was partially about Ronald Reagan's speech. But I got asked if I'd be interested in seeing and editing Ronald Reagan's diary. I did not realize he kept a diary. I heard a little bit about it, that there may have been one. Certainly other presidents have kept diaries. I have used Alan Nevin's edited versions of James K. Polk's diary, Benjamin Harrison diary, the John Quincy Adams diary. There are presidents that keep diaries. But what's stunning, I found out about the Reagan diary when I went out to look at it, and I kind of came out just to assess what it was. It was kept every single day Ronald Reagan was president. He kept diary inserts every day in the White House but 4. Those 4 days he didn't when he was shot. So all handwritten, big leather-bound books, and everybody would always say Reagan would go to bed early after dinner. Everybody thought he was going to bed and drinking warm milk and cookies and going to sleep. What he was doing every night, like a fox, was keeping this document for posterity, where he could settle scores, where he could twist his own historical legacy, where he could tell about what he was really feeling, where he could have a memory of some things he wanted to remember. He used the diaries as people do. as his record of these 8 years. And we've had this spat of people telling us what Ronald Reagan thought, and there's a cottage industry of books and memoirs. But the advent of these diaries will show at least, and it does not either enhance or it depends on how you look at history or foreign policy, whether this makes Reagan's image grow or it detracts. Some passages might move you, some may sicken you. It's up to the reader in that regard. I'm simply in this particular project trying to annotate and edit and bring to life this resource for scholars and the general public. The first volume, what I'm doing, if I had to publish them all, we'd be looking at about 4 or 5 volumes of the Reagan Diaries. So for HarperCollins, I'm editing and doing one about 800-page annotated volume will come out in May. Then, over the next 2 or 3 year period, editing the regular ones and getting them annotated in a more of a university press kind of fashion than a trade publication, but having that out there for people. The diary was kept by Nancy Reagan all these years. She's decided to let it out, I believe, due to perhaps frailty, or if she feels the time's right. She certainly has nothing to fear from the diaries. As you all know, they have this historic love relationship, and that radiates from a lot of these White House diaries. Whenever Nancy Reagan leaves, he's heartbroken and is staring out the window, when will Nancy return, and writes about her in the most glowing fashions one could possibly imagine. But I will tell you, and I'm going to read you a few pieces of just from one year, 1981. It's the sheer mass of these diaries that numbs you, because it sets the record straight on a whole host of different issues. And some of these diary entries, different days, are short. Some go on for pages. Sometimes they're heartfelt, sometimes they're not. But there are a couple of general rules before I read you some of these. One is President Reagan consciously didn't use swear words. When he did, which was quite often, he just would put dashes. So instead of hell, it'd be H-L, or damn, D-N. Obviously, as an editor, you leave that kind of thing the way he wanted it, because it shows his sense of posterity and that he wasn't going to be associated with curse words. There is at times you can't help but feel that you can start seeing who his real inner circle is. He comes out as much more of a pragmatist than perhaps a conservative. His inner circle is James Baker, fittingly, for being here, George Shultz, Michael Deaver, Nancy Reagan, and Ed Meese. He did not like extremes in the foreign policy crowd. He liked the rhetoric of toughness with kind of velvet diplomacy dealing with the Soviet Union. His staunch anti-communism comes out throughout. There's also almost a pathological need to go on for pages on people that are ill, and particularly people that are handicapped. I mean, his movie he thought he deserved an Academy Award for was King's Row, when he had lost the legs and was laying in bed, and he constantly in his life reflected on that inability to walk. And he's constantly refers to Franklin Roosevelt. When you ask what a president, who he looks up to, it's FDR. He began his career in radio, Ronald Reagan, at World of Chiropractor Radio in Davenport, Iowa, and was emulating FDR with the cigarette and memorized the speeches. Peggy Noonan, writing his speeches, tried to be FDR-like in her speeches for Reagan. I was telling at lunch today, there's I'm not going to read it because I didn't bring it with me to read, but there's a scene in there where he talks about trying to create a Franklin Roosevelt memorial and reflects how his father was a New Dealer and how he was a Roosevelt Democrat, and Roosevelt was the greatest man he ever knew, and how much he always goes on about FDR in these diaries while in the White House. But then says, so nothing angers me more when they say that I'm trying to undermine the New Deal. There's nothing to the contrary. I love the New Deal. What I want to do is destroy the Great Society. And he said it that bluntly in the diaries. And it puts you into that frame of what Reagan's operating in the 80s, after the 60s. The boys appoint to Hawk story is important because constantly in the diaries, he's going back to World War II as if Vietnam never happened. The tearing up of the nation, two sides. You just look at the last election over Vietnam, the swift boats and anti-swift boat, and even among veterans of Vietnam, there's this sort of huge disagreement going on. Reagan just acted as if amnesia over that period. And he also, the other president who he talks about a lot is Dwight Eisenhower. And he became a Republican because of Eisenhower. He was one of those Americans that when Ike ran in the 50s was going to run as a Democrat, he would have stayed. He went to the Republican Party because of Eisenhower. Again, it's that World War II connection to President Reagan. Here's just, I brought a few, and I have to tell you, this is the only talk I'm giving on the diaries until the publication, because I'm not supposed to be doing very much with them till they come out. But I thought I'd read a few lines here and then just comment on them. This is 1981. He begins, at the inauguration. And there's one line here on Wednesday, January 28th. He's only been a president a couple days. He meets the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And it was his first state luncheon, was the Prime Minister. And he was very excited that Jamaica had, in his words, had overcome a Cuban-backed pro-communist candidate. And he said, I think we can help him. And he's talking about the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And he's saying, gradually we will take back the Caribbean, which is becoming a red lake. And from his red lake analogy, he goes on throughout, and you can follow his thinking through Iran-Contra and this determination of keeping the Caribbean and as part of an American sphere, a Monroe Doctrine kind of like attitude, where he seems more concerned. At one point in the diaries, he's saying that, I'm begging for reasons to make Castro's life miserable, and demands a list of things he can do to purposefully upset Castro. There's this side of him coming out in the hemisphere. Here, a couple days later, February 4th, talking about the grain embargo of Carter, the embargo with Russia, the Soviet Union. Cabinet discussion of grain embargo. I've always felt it hurt our farmers worse than it hurt Soviets. Many of our allies, with a lot of question marks after allies, filled the food gap and supplied Soviets grain. But now, how do we lift it without sending wrong message to Soviets? We need to take a new look at a whole matter of strategy. Trade was supposed to make Soviets moderate. Instead, it has allowed them to build armaments instead of consumer products. Their socialism is an economic failure. Wouldn't we be doing more for their people if we let their system fail instead of constantly bailing it out? At the same time, he's dealing with issues of dealing with Iran, and of course the hostages got released, and this is his starting to strong-arm people behind the scenes. February 8th, he's talking about thank you letters for gifts we found on the second floor Friday night. Took an entire Saturday morning to open. Then he said, just had a call from Al Haig. I asked him that we quietly have Swiss tell Iranians if they do not free Mrs. Dwyer, an American woman they had charged with being a spy and in prison, we might find it difficult to implement the terms of the Carter hostage agreement. Guess what? It worked. Mrs. Dwyer is coming home. She was turned over to the Swiss. Word is that 2 weeks of hostage negotiations were completely dominated by Iranian fear that they have to negotiate with our administration. I couldn't be happier. That's the way I want it. Pointing out the sense of a fear tactic through rhetoric of being that frightened of who Reagan will be as president and using that to his advantage. March 3rd, I'm simplifying pages here, just reading a few lines. He says, during the day I did an hour interview with Walter Cronkite, his last for CBS. He spent the first 20 minutes on El Salvador. He didn't throw any slow balls, but the reaction was favorable. Because of our dinner, we couldn't watch the show, but I was treated to another White House service. He's constantly amazed all the perks he's getting here. They taped the program and played it back to us later that evening. Every night, Reagan got a tape made of his performance that day wherever he was or spoke and studied himself like it's a Hollywood daily. It's a very sharp contrast to President Bush, who never watches himself. They're total extremes. He writes about it constantly. Frank Reynolds, ABC, I watch him. He critiques everything from his suit, whether he should wear a handkerchief, whether he was sweating, whether he had counts how many times he said whether totally obsessive on his image as projecting the image he wanted to project. Here's March 13, 81, just a different one. Nancy off to New York. I'm to join her there. The Reverend Jesse Jackson announces he's staging a march on Washington Monument demanding help for Atlanta in this 19-month tragedy of the murders of black children, which is so far number 20 with one missing. Atlanta has a financial problem due to $100,000 a month overtime for police. What Jesse apparently doesn't know is that we've already given Atlanta about $1 million and have roughly 40 FBI agents in there on the case. Today I went to the press briefing room and read a statement detailing this and then announcing we are giving another $1.5 million and that Vice President George Bush was going personally to Atlanta. The problem with Jackson is he likes to grandstand. Finished calling a number of State Department professionals, appointing them to ambassadorial post. No president has ever done this personally before. I'm enjoying doing some of the things I'm then told presidents haven't done before. He constantly likes to do the first of everything, that he likes to know what other presidents do so he can be the first. In this case, personally telling the ambassadors, you've been picked for Luxembourg, you've been picked for Denmark, you making the calls or meeting them in person to tell them the news. He goes on, flew into LaGuardia and then helicoptered around the lower tip of Manhattan and landed on a helipad on the Lower West Side. The usual lengthy motorcade with police closing off intersections and taking us traffic-free through town. One thing was unusual and very humbling. The streets were lined with people as if for a parade all the way to the Waldorf. They cheered and clapped, and I wore my arms out, waving back to them. And he then goes on from being there talking about in New York this notion of how he knows people are going to, he goes on a great deal about his speech that he gives. And he always critiques the different speeches that he makes. Here's one after the speech he gave going March 30th when he was shot in 81. My day to address the Building and Construction Trades National Conference AFL-CIO at the Hilton Ballroom, 2 p.m. Was all dressed to go, and for some reason at the last minute took off my really good wristwatch and wore an older one. Speech not riotously received. Still it was successful. Left the hotel at the usual side entrance and headed for the car. Suddenly there was a burst of gunfire from the left. A Secret Service agent pushed me onto the floor of the car and jumped on top. I felt a blow in my upper back that was unbelievably painful. I was sure he'd broken my rib. The car took off. I sat up on the edge of the seat, almost paralyzed by pain. Then I began coughing up blood, which made us both think, yes, I had broken a rib and it had punctured a lung. He switched orders from the White House to George Washington Hospital. By the time we arrived, I was having great trouble getting enough air. We did not know that Tim McCarthy of SS, Secret Service, had been shot in the chest, Jim Brady in the head, and a policeman, Tom Delahanty, in the neck. I walked into the emergency room and was hoisted onto a cart where I was stripped of my clothes. It was then we learned I'd been shot and had a bullet in my lung. Getting shot hurts. Still, my fear was growing because no matter how hard I tried to breathe, it seemed I was getting less and less air. I focused on the tile ceiling and prayed. But I realized I couldn't ask for God's help while at the same time I felt hatred for the mixed-up young man who had shot me. Isn't that the meaning of the last sheep? We are all God's children and therefore equally beloved by him. I began to pray for his soul and that he would find his way back into the fold. I opened my eyes once to find Nancy there. I pray I'll never face a day when she isn't there. Of all the ways God has blessed me, giving her to me is the greatest and beyond anything I can ever hope to deserve. All the kids arrived, and the hours ran together in a blur during which I was operated on. I know it's going to be a long recovery, but there has been such an outpouring of love from all over. The days of therapy, transfusion, intravenous, etc. have gone by. Now it's Saturday, April 11th, and this morning I left the hospital, and I'm here in the White House with Nancy and Patty. The treatment, the warmth, the skill at GW of the doctors, those doctors at George Washington has been magnificent, but it's great to be here at home. Whatever happens now, I owe my life to God and will try to serve him in every way that I can. For days he goes on after this detailing his recovery efforts, kind of micro health fashion. Obviously, it's very powerful insert. Later here, I wasn't going to read this, but he's talking. He keeps going back and forth on hating Hinckley for shooting him, and he's obsessed with this last sheep in the flock thought. And finally, Billy Graham, he says here a few days later, after a bunch of diaries worrying about his hatred for this kid and how he can't quite get to the forgiving place. He said, later in the day, talk with phone by Billy Graham. He knows the family of the young man who did the shooting. They are decent, deeply religious people who are completely crushed by the sickness of their son. Then he starts dealing with Graham every day on his how to get forgiveness for this guy's heart, and that and eventually he's convinced he doesn't have hatred anymore, and he makes a great long pages over that. What he did that was pretty clever was when he had all these people criticizing him in the media and Democrats and people in his own party for that matter, he would take just pop shots and call them something for history really ugly, but then he was free of it because he knew it'd come out like now, and he'd get his revenge on the long term instead of the short term. And so here's on Easter. It says, a beautiful Easter morning in the afternoon, Reverend Lewis Evans and his wife called and brought us communion. They made it the most meaningful day. Watched some TV in bed and saw Gloria Steinem take me over the coals for being a bigot and against women. Either she is totally ignorant of my positions, which I doubt, or she is a deliberate liar. I believe it's the second. Only part I've working with National Security Council we've really kept most of this in. They've only some Middle East bits have been pulled out, and Mrs. Reagan intervened with them because they were trying to cut a lot of these things. But all of them are in except for a couple. But April 23rd, here's Reagan of 81, met with Senator Baker regarding the AWACS sale to Saudi Arabia and the fuss being kicked up about it. He made a sound suggestion that we don't present the proposal to Congress until after next week's votes on the economic program. I'm disturbed by the reaction, the opposition of so many groups in the Jewish community. First of all, it must be plain to them that they've never had a better friend of Israel in the White House than they have now. We are striving to bring stability to the Middle East and reduce the threat of a Soviet move in that direction. The basis for such stability must be peace between Israel and the Arab nations. The Saudis are the key to this. If they can follow the counsel of Egypt, the rest might fall into place. The AWACS won't be theirs until 1985. In the meantime, much can be accomplished to furthering the Camp David format. We have assured the Israelis we will do whatever is needed to see that any help to the Arab states, and then he underlines, does not change the balance of power between them and the Arabs. Last night, watched the NBC special on our first 100 days. If only Bobby Burns, the poet Robert Burns that he liked quoting a lot, if only Bobby Burns had waited for TV, he would never have written, if only we had the gift to see ourselves as others see us. Attached is the script letter for my diary that I wrote to Brezhnev by hand today, and it's a long handwritten note to Brezhnev, which did not get sent. And it's fascinating. May 28th, here's some of his views with Chernansky. Latest on Nimitz disaster, 14 dead, 44 injured. Had an NSC meeting. Gave the go-ahead to a plan for the Caribbean and Central American countries to help the smaller ones economically and with social reforms, plus military aid to protect against Cuban exported radicals. Will involve or ask to involve Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, and others. I propose that the answer to the Haitians continuing to come here as illegal aliens for economic reasons should be a program to upgrade Haiti's economy so it could provide jobs for its people. That will cost some money. Cabinet meeting. Democrats finally have come up with a counter-proposal to our tax program. They want to include a reduction of the income tax rate on unearned income from 70% to the 50% top rate on earned income. We wanted that in the first place, but we're sure they'd attack us as favoring the rich. Several of their other proposals are things we wanted. Decision is, I'll reluctantly give in, provided they'll accept the 3-year across-the-board cut, which will be 5 to 10 and 10 instead of 10-10 and 10 we originally proposed. I'll hail it as a great bipartisan solution. Hell, H-L, it's more than I thought we could get. I'm delighted to get the 70 down to 50. All we give up is the first year 10% beginning last January to 5% beginning this October. Instead of 30% over 3 years, 36 months, it will be 25% over 27 months. He goes on then about the dinner party, and then that evening with a wildlife expert and the head of the Smithsonian. And then goes on and says, I almost forgot to mention the first meeting of the day. Mrs. Chernansky and a young Jewish refugee from the Gulag, 10 years in prison, came to see me. Mrs. S. married her husband 10 years ago. She had a visa to leave Russia for Israel the day after the wedding. She left. The authorities told her the groom would be allowed to leave very soon to join her. He is in the Gulag, was never allowed to leave, and is said to have been an American spy, which is a lie. He never was. Damn those inhumane Soviet monsters. He is said to be down to 100 pounds and very ill. I promised I'd do everything I could to sustain his release, and I will. I will get him out. I'll just read real quick 2 other little ones and summarize and take questions. The June 9th, after meetings with President Lopez and Mexican officials, he's talking, it's at the end of his day. Ended the day with the National Security Council meeting regarding the bombing of Iraq. President Reagan insists that the plant was preparing to produce nuclear weapons for use on Israel. If he waited till the French shipment of hot uranium arrived, he couldn't order the bombing because of the radiation that would be loosed over Baghdad. I can understand his fear, but feel he took the wrong option, meaning Reagan. He should have told us and the French we could have done something to remove the threat. However, we're not turning on Israel. That would be an invitation for the Arabs to attack. It's time to raise hell worldwide for a settlement of the Middle East problem. What has happened is the result of fear and suspicion at both sides. We need a real push for a solid peace. There's a lot throughout obviously on Israel. Here's one thing about Sandra Day O'Connor and about Reagan starting to see his difficult relationship, oddly, with the right at times with his administration. This morning I announced my nominee for Supreme Court, Mrs. O'Connor of Arizona. I made some calls because someone has started a bonfire among the right-to-life people. Apparently it all started with a woman, a Dr. Greston in Phoenix. Her claims don't match the record we have of O'Connor's voting record when she was a state senator. but she spread her message far and wide. Conservatives shouldn't eat their own. Like they're doing to O'Connor. A full cabinet meeting on the Fort Chaffee problem. Cubans, criminal and mentally deranged, dumped on us by Castro. We believe we can move them to unused military base in Maryland, which can be developed also as a holding area for legitimate refugees in the future. I'll stop, but it gives you a little bit of a taste. Those are just some from the first months of 81, and he continues this to 88. The two landmark parts of the diaries will be extracting the material about the Soviet Union. None of that got redacted by the NSC. It's all there. It's about his feelings for Gorbachev and how that what he was trying to accomplish in foreign policy. I might add that on only a couple days in office, he put as his #1 goal as president is to reduce nuclear weapons stockpiles by half in the world. And that if it took 1 term or 2 terms, he wasn't going to leave office till he achieved that goal. There's a lot in these diaries about foreign policy, and I'm keeping the foreign policy material in here with some of the economic parts being cut. Let me just read you this one last thing. It's for July 10th. Prime Minister Trudeau arrived on his way back from a trip to Europe. We discussed the Ottawa Summit meeting coming up in about 9 days. I believe it will be a general meeting to discuss economic issues, North-South relations, and some East-West trade matters. At lunch, we finally got around to 3 bilateral issues. On their side, they want action on acid rain, which they believe results from air pollution on our side of the border. I assured him that we are researching that because we have people in Vermont who think they are getting acid rain from Canada. Second issue is the pipeline to be built from Prudhoe Bay down to Calgary to join the existing pipeline to the United States. The whole project was conceived during the energy crunch. Carter pledged we'd go through with it even though the Alaska portion was and is supposed to be built by private enterprise. The problem is that now no one but Canada thinks or at least is sure it should be built. There have been new gas discoveries down here, and it might be more practical for Alaskan gas to be liquefied and sold to Japan. Other issue had to do with discriminatory tax policy on American-owned business in Canada, which, while we do nothing of the kind to Canadian-owned businesses on our side of the border. He grew very defensive. I think our problem is that he leans toward outright nationalization of industry. He left, and then I met with Board of Black State Legislators organization. A good meeting, better than the NAACP in Denver. I think they discovered I might be different than the image they had. Martin Luther King Jr. is a hero, and I won't let his legacy down. Final meeting with Republican representatives and senators on defense matters. Much of it had to do with whether we should go for the B-1 or wait for the newer stealth bomber, which may not fly for 10 years or so, if at all. MX was also a problem, particularly having to do with how it will be deployed. No decision from defense or me yet, but I lean against the proposed racetrack system. At 4:30, we left for Camp David. Almost upon arrival, the relaxing began. What a joy that beautiful spot is getting to be. Any rate, the hope I have of bringing these diaries out is that, and particularly the multiple volumes, that it'll really set at least Reagan's views on things. It might get his image a little bit in line. I wrote an article for The New Yorker a few years back on a woman named Lorraine Wagner, who Reagan wrote 267 letters to. She was the head of his Philadelphia fan club from the 40s. And was a Democrat who and worked in a working class, and he would write her all of these letters from the White House. And what's startling about Reagan is how much he wrote, and not just in these diaries, but the correspondence that's coming out right now to just regular people. And part of his routine was demanding letters be brought to him from fans or from critics. And as president, they weren't formulators. He would write, usually on a week, something 20, 30 letters out of the White House to people that were everyday citizens. This was his way of feeling in touch. It was a habit he picked up early in life with his fan club. He kept doing that through General Electric years, through California, and it was his way of feeling that he was directly communicating with humans and American people. So I think I went on long enough with all this, but it's one of the works that I'm doing. I might add, the main book I'm writing right now is to do with Theodore Roosevelt and conservation. I'm doing a book on how TR created our national monuments. This is the 100th year of the Antiquities Act of '06, and then our national wildlife refuges, how he created them. So I'm dealing with John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, Theodore Roosevelt, and conservation policy is my main research effort. And I have a small book coming out for this presidency series that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is editing. I'm doing the Gerald Ford book. So I've just finished with looking at those 2 years of Ford's presidency and kind of assessing it as a historian. Thank you all very much, and I'd love to take any questions you have. Yes, sir.
What process do you follow in going through all of this and deciding what to weed out and what to leave in? How long is it ultimately going to be, as best you can guess, and when is it going to be finished?
The first volume for HarperCollins, my publisher, will be out in May, but that's going to be selections, and that's my hard part right now. I decided to cut, and I'm sorry for economists here to say this, but I'm cutting some of the domestic economic tax material in favor of the foreign affairs, a little bit heavy, and the personal, particularly about his children, which he writes about a lot, and says a little bit of he's worried that he's a terrible father a lot, which is, I found it unusual that he put some of that in writing like that, because it made me feel that he wasn't doing this all for posterity when you come across those. But then over the next few years, we're going to bring out, I would say in about 3 years, all of them will be out. HarperCollins has made a commitment to do the 1 volume and then bring out scholarly, annotated, collected. I don't know whether they'll do them one at a time. Here's 81 and 82, 83, or whether they'll do one box set with a few volumes. That hasn't been determined, but the goal is to get them out, in a relatively brisk fashion. Yes, sir.
3 questions. Number one, it's been said that the latter part of his presidency is beginning to show signs of Alzheimer's. Does that show up in his writings? That's one question. The other would be of his inner circle, who would be the kind of the leader. It was said that Reagan was a mouthpiece for a cabal of people. Were his thinking influenced more so by one group than the other? And the third is maybe comparing to some of these other presidents that you're looking at. Is his intellect or purported intellect is good, better, or than some of the other people?
Those are great questions. The first one, no, there are 0 signs of Alzheimer's. In fact, 87 and 88, he's writing stronger and more vigorously, including about Iran-Contra. And there's what's stunning about that is that these weren't subpoenaed. And it's hence why I think he kept them with Nancy. Only Michael Deaver and Baker, I think, slightly knew, but nobody really knew. This was not keeping these something Reagan broadcast to people. The Alzheimer's is not there. The writing, and I mentioned today at lunch, I'm going to go to an Alzheimer's doctor soon, a specialist, to ask them to look at this writing and to see, because I'm not an expert on Alzheimer's, but there's no evidence to me of any. And Nancy Reagan herself has long claimed that he did not have any signs of Alzheimer's until after his presidency, when he had a terrible head injury, and that he apparently was never the same. He fell off a horse, his head, and she claims that that's a year later he got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but that trauma had triggered the distress. So that is kind of interesting in the diaries, that they're sustainable in those last years, and everything's very logical and full. The second question, James Baker had the best line when he had said about President Reagan that we all left the room thinking that we were the smarter ones in the room with Reagan, and it turned out that he barely knew who we all were, kind of thing. He was an old man in the White House. He had lived a very full life. he truly missed his ranch in California. He wasn't looking for anything after the White House. And there was he treated everybody equally. There was an egalitarian spirit to him, in the sense that he treated somebody who was a door person the exact same as he would treat a U.S. Senator or Supreme Court Justice. He had no sense of elitism in that regard. I'm not saying policy-wise he didn't. I'm talking one-on-one with people. It's one of the reasons I think his legacy is captured people's imagination. He was many things, but he wasn't a pretentious person. He never had fits of yelling at anybody who worked for him. People saw him angry a few times, but no visible anger. But the person he counted on the most in the big decisions, beyond Nancy Reagan as a category of herself, is George Shultz. And that's probably when the deal's going down and the right is turning on Reagan and on having any kind of conversations with Russia about doing away with at Reykjavik, and when Reagan puts on the table, let's get rid of all nuclear weapons and all of this. He's constantly working with Shultz. He likes Shultz's quiet demeanor. Remember, he lived in Hollywood and had a lot of hot dogs around. He saw them come and go. The two people that he's very critical of, I mean, beyond him constantly complaining about the Democratic opposition, never personal about them. In fact, Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy are very positively dealt with, even while he's arguing with them. But was Jack Kemp, who he did not like, and Al Haig. And he didn't like them because they both were disruptive for serenity. He did not like meetings, as I was mentioning at lunch, actually. He liked to find a silver lining out of a conversation in a meeting and liked a positive attitude, and did not like people that were coming out with their problems on him. He wanted their view, not their problems. And they would always, both of them seemed to always have problems, and it drove him crazy because, as he would say, they're disrupting my team. And Shultz never did that. Shultz was the most quiet. They used to tease Shultz. He'd write in here how they're all they all make fun of George for being asleep, and he's the only one that's really awake. And Baker comes out, just saying that because I'm at Baker Institute. Baker comes out exceedingly well, and as an advisor, and so does, but much younger. Shultz is more of a kind of an equal footing, and I think, and as I mentioned, maybe I didn't. Former 41 or Vice President Bush was much more involved with a lot of big decisions than it comes across in his memoir with Scowcroft or in his public pronouncements. Bush. Reagan's leaning on his views more than one had supposed. Your last question, how does Reagan fit as a writer and other presidents? He's underestimated, but he's not a deep intellectual. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt wrote all these brilliant books and was brilliant, and his Thomas Jefferson and Roosevelt are in a category of their own, and Lincoln had this way to inspire. There's kind of a hallmark quality to a lot of Reagan, but he could communicate very well on paper. He wrote his own radio speeches, and on big issues that he was right about them. I mean, his predictions of the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, was considered kooky by people in the 60s, and many of the things you read them today, they had a prophetic cast to them. But he was what he was. He read a lot, but he loved all the books of was, which I have to drop him a note, is Larry McMurtry. All of those novels of McMurtry, all of even one in terms of endearment or Anything But Billy, and even ones that were a whole group of those. And then he usually would read novels that were like the bestsellers of the time, not totally trashy novels, but the next tier of popular kind of things. And then the Western, like Eisenhower, the Louis L'Amour, and Zane Grey. This is a combination of going on there's a great scene in here when he's talking about, one thing about him that I promise you that's very different. He never would do military-wise what President Bush did with the Mission Accomplished, the donning of the uniform to pretend that wasn't his thing. He was the suit the statesman, like he said, I could play the statesman role, but he never wanted to refused to take any kind of award for anybody claiming he ever did anything, because he'd get angry when people would try to give him things to say because he was a veteran of the Second World War. He knew he didn't fight. He knew that, and he was never bragged about himself in a military fashion at all. And he few times mentions that. It kind of jumps out at you. But he loved Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt as the two presidents. The FDR part, it's the communication, the way those speeches of Roosevelt on the radio, just power, and he wanted to be that. And also, he saw that Roosevelt was fighting totalitarianism in World War II, Hitler, and he saw that he was fighting totalitarianism in the Cold War, the Soviets. Scholars may not make that link, but he did. He saw himself as a natural fighter of, against that. Yes.
I was just curious, since the passages you read came entirely from Reagan's first year of the presidency, I was wondering if you could comment on what changes or developments, not only in obviously the content, but the style in which he's approaching the questions and problems that he's encountering, and in particular, I was curious to know whether this sort of kind of almost obsessive interest in his image and his presentation, was that continuous throughout the period of the diaries, or is that sort of unique to the first?
Good question. Oh boy, see, if I went closer, I wouldn't have had to strain my voice. It's throughout.
Okay.
I think it's the most consistent aspect of him that comes across is his image making in the presidency. I don't say it it just is for him. And probably he was too obsessive with that, but he got results from it. It's probably better than not being. He liked to see anything that he was on, any show, he'd watch himself. Now, a lot of people don't like even seeing themselves, but he was studying himself. Again, they do that in Hollywood. I have some friends who are actors, and they shoot for the day. Somebody whips together a DVD. They sit in the trailer and watch their dailies of whatever they shot that day to see how they might improve their character more. Think of all the movies Reagan did. Think about him in the White House. That seemed like the way to do it. It does lead some credence to this concept that there's critics will say Reagan was playing the role of president, and it's certainly his acting career was the crux of who he was, and that worked for him in Hollywood, and he figured it worked for him in politics. But it gets down to not praising himself. He's looking for the deficiencies in his presentation, emphasis on words, and he'll say, I can't believe I used that. I've got to be more direct, cut it down. I saw my speech I gave today. I spoke 10 minutes too long. People are bored. Short attention spans are short. Keep it down, Ronnie. Like that kind of that ability to almost remove himself and then critique himself.
I was just thinking about how do you think that particular characteristic, influenced the way that he approached policy questions, or actually influenced his decision-making style? I mean, was that sort of an ever-present?
I think it's ever present. I think it's a way. He was a salesman on what he wanted to achieve, but he had that instinct of lead. It's his way of leading. He was not somebody you can't, whether you like Reagan or dislike him or think he was a good president or a bad president. He was a leader because he had views and implemented them. But one could argue President Bush is a leader, has strong views, and so the differences be whether what you're leading and advocating, as a leader is correct or not. And I think his legacy will rest largely on the Soviet Union. And there's an academic debate. Did Reagan contribute to the breakdown of the Soviet Union? I think the diaries enhanced at least that notion that Reagan was constant on the belief as president the Soviet Union was going to collapse and he was going to help it. I read you the dissident thing in the Gulag, and I'm going to get them out no matter what, and these inhuman bastards kind of thing. And that's there. but it's not as conservative, it's not as an ideologue. It's kind of this Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms kind of thing, freedom thing. And there's a line in the Middle East at one point. He says a line about after Lebanon, why not sending in after the Marines were blown up there. He said, I've got to be very careful sending, but they're pushing me, defense, and people are pushing me and talking about these people. And he said, you can always have they sometimes forget that you can always have a war in the Middle East. So he's, they're just sort of these kind of things that he writes that I think will get some attention simply because it's his thing. He's not a deep intellect. On the other hand, he's coherent. There's nothing that you say with that's over bizarre. His astrology references might be a little bit, but that's sort of well known that we would mention them here or there, or the apocalypse. It's odd to see a president of the United States in his handwriting more than it will be in the book, but seeing in his handwriting talking about the apocalypse. It's sort of odd, you don't expect a president to be thinking about a possible apocalypse. So it's that California religious side of Reagan that I probably needs more thinking at this, what he believes is his role and how that plays into policy. The diaries shed a little light, and even the Billy Graham, I'm reading you when he's the God and the last thing, and there's a religious side, but on the other hand, he's not pushing a pro-life or what you would, I guess, call today he's not a neocon. And he's, in fact, you even see his disagreements with Israel constantly, and like they're driving him nuts, and there's nuts. So he's different. He's a pragmatist more than an ideologue. One more here, and we'll let you all go home.
This is almost, it feels almost nosy,
No, it's
but
okay.
What do you have to say about Mrs. Thatcher?
Wildly complimentary from their first meeting. He documents obviously every time they meet because there are always big occasions and they're important to him, but they form this symbiotic friendship. But I don't think there's much new there because everybody pretty much knows that already, but the general the love. There is a funny thing after when the Queen comes to the ranch, and the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara is this tiny place, and she comes there in the pouring rain, and they have to all use the same toilet, and he writes a kind of about her having to use this tiny little bathroom, and it's the Queen living on this place. But Thatcher's his great ally on all of this. What's conscious that he was right about was that the Soviet Union was he was intuitively on to the notion the Soviet Union's stresses were as great as we now know they really were, and that he believed that you kept the pressure on, but diplomacy always behind the scenes. That early little line I read you is constant throughout. Make them be scared of me. But then we have diplomacy behind. Make them, remember the Reagan years are not known for war. Yes, we shot down Libya's plane. Yes, there was Grenada on this notion of showing that we care about the Caribbean. But these aren't war years, which is odd because like Theodore Roosevelt, who won a Nobel Peace Prize and kept America out of war, the 80s were times of arms reduction, not war, yet we consider both TR and Roosevelt hawks because of their rhetoric sometimes. When you study the policy, there's something else going on, and in Reagan's case, it's there's a religious something that you can't quite get, but he does not want to be the one responsible for deaths that are unnecessary in the world. Thank you all. Have a great weekend. Appreciate it.